Forget everything you think you know about a wedding night. The candles, the flowers, the whispered promises between two people who chose each other freely. The idea that marriage begins with intimacy, with desire, with a door quietly closing on a private world built for two. None of that existed in first-century Judea. What existed instead was something far older, far harder, and far more consequential. A system so intricately woven into the fabric of family, economics, religion, and survival that a single wedding night could determine the fate of an entire household for generations. Not just the fate of the couple, the fate of their parents, their siblings, their grandchildren who hadn't been born yet. So what actually happened on that night? What was at stake? Who was watching? And why did Jesus grow up surrounded by a culture where the most intimate moment of a young woman's life was also, by design, the most public? Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels. It changes how we understand Mary. It changes how we understand Joseph's reaction when he discovered she was pregnant. And it changes how we understand what Jesus meant when he spoke about shame, about mercy, and about the kind of love that chooses dignity over protocol. To understand the wedding night, you have to understand the village. In first-century Judea, whether in the hills of Galilee, the dusty flatlands near Jericho, or the crowded neighborhoods pressed against the walls of Jerusalem, most people lived not in isolated houses, but in clusters. Extended families shared adjoining rooms built around a central courtyard. You woke each morning to the sound of your aunt grinding grain. You fell asleep each night with your cousins a wall's width away. Privacy, as a concept, barely existed. The air in those villages carried everything at once. The smoke from cooking fires fueled by dried dung and olive wood, the sour smell of fermenting grain, the ammonia edge of animals penned just beyond the courtyard wall. In the summer months, heat pressed down like a hand on the back of the neck, and nothing dried quickly. Not cloth, not bread, not tears. In winter, the limestone walls held cold the way stone holds cold everywhere, and families slept close together under heavy woven blankets, not out of tenderness alone, but out of necessity. Streets in Galilean villages were not streets in the modern sense. They were narrow, unpaved passages between structures, barely wide enough for two people to pass, wider in places to accommodate a donkey carrying water jugs. Neighbors knew every face, every voice, every domestic argument that spilled past a doorway. There was no anonymity. There was no such thing as a secret that stayed a secret for long. Into this world, a young woman was born, usually betrothed by her father before she had reached her teens, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, to a man chosen not for love, but for alliance, for economic stability, for the consolidation of family interests. She had not chosen him. He had not chosen her, not in the romantic sense. Their families had chosen each other. This is where the story of the wedding night actually begins, not on the night itself, but years earlier, when two fathers shook hands over a contract, when a bride price was negotiated, when a young girl was transferred, legally, socially, spiritually, from the protection of one man to the protection of another. The betrothal period, called erusin in Hebrew, was not a modern engagement. It was legally binding. The betrothed woman was already considered her future husband's wife in all legal respects. She could not break the contract without a formal bill of divorce. If she was found to have been unfaithful during this period, the legal consequences were the same as those for adultery in a fully established marriage. This is precisely why Joseph's reaction to Mary's pregnancy, described in Matthew's Gospel, carries the weight it does. He was not a boyfriend deciding whether to stay or go. He was a legally bound husband confronting what appeared to be a catastrophic violation of covenant. And if you have ever read that passage and wondered why Joseph's first instinct was to divorce her quietly rather than to simply walk away, now you understand. Walking away was not an option. The legal architecture of betrothal made it impossible. But back to the village, back to the years between betrothal and marriage. During this period, the young woman continued to live in her father's house. She was prepared, taught, trained, observed. Her mother and the older women of the household showed her how to manage a home, how to grind grain into flour, how to measure oil, how to preserve figs and olives, how to spin wool and weave cloth, how to manage the perpetual negotiation between what a family needed and what it actually had. These were not decorative skills. They were survival skills. A woman who did not know how to manage a household's resources, how to stretch what little there was across a week of unpredictable need, was a liability, not an asset. At the same time, she was also being watched for something else entirely. Her conduct during the betrothal period was scrutinized in ways that modern readers find uncomfortable to confront directly. Her physical movements in the village, the company she kept, the hours she kept, all of it was observed, noted, and interpreted. Her reputation, and by extension her family's reputation, rested in large part on the visible evidence of her virtue. And that evidence, that proof, would be demanded of her on the night her marriage was finally consummated. Not metaphorically demanded, literally, physically, ritually. What was required on the wedding night was not simply a union between two people. It was a public certification of the bride's virginity. And the mechanism by which that certification was performed was as specific, as procedural, and as consequential as anything in the legal system of that world. The stakes could not have been higher. The wrong outcome, or even the appearance of the wrong outcome, could destroy a family overnight. The wedding itself did not begin on the night of the wedding. It began days before, sometimes a full week before, in a slow, building crescendo of preparation that involved not just the two families, but the entire village. In a world without entertainment as we understand it, without theaters or public spectacles available to ordinary people, a wedding was one of the few occasions when an entire community could stop working, gather, eat, drink, and celebrate without apology. It was not a private ceremony. It was a communal event. And that communal character was not incidental. It was essential to everything that followed. The groom's family bore the primary financial weight of the celebration. They had already paid the bride price, the mohar, to the bride's father, a negotiated sum that varied according to the social standing and perceived value of both families. This payment was not purchasing a person in the way a modern reader might recoil from. It was, in the economic logic of that world, a form of compensation to the bride's family for the loss of her labor and her reproductive future, and a demonstration that the groom's family had the resources to care for her. A man who could not pay a respectable bride price was a man whose ability to provide was already in question before the marriage began. Then came the feast. In Galilee, wedding feasts typically lasted 7 days. 7 full days of eating, drinking, music, dancing, storytelling, and the kind of sustained communal joy that is almost impossible to imagine in a world of individual schedules and private lives. The entire village was invited, not as guests who might or might not attend, but as participants in something that concerned them all. Because in a village economy built on mutual dependence, a new household was not a private matter. It was a new productive unit entering the community. Everyone had a stake in its beginning. Wine was central to the feast, not as luxury, but as necessity, as the social lubricant, the symbol of abundance, the liquid embodiment of blessing. To run out of wine at a wedding feast was not merely an inconvenience. It was a public humiliation that would be remembered and spoken of for years, possibly for a generation. It would attach itself to the groom's family like a stain, suggesting either poverty, poor planning, or both. The shame of it was real and lasting. This is why the scene at the wedding in Cana, recorded in John's Gospel, carries such compressed urgency. When Mary approaches Jesus and says simply, "They have no wine," she is not making a casual observation. She is describing a social catastrophe in progress. A family's reputation is collapsing in real time, in front of everyone who knows them, at the moment that should have been the peak of their dignity. And Jesus, who grew up in Galilee, who had attended dozens of such feasts, who understood precisely what those words meant, responds not with detachment, but with action. He knew what was at stake. He had always known. But the feast was only the preparation, the climax of the wedding week, the moment toward which everything else built, was the wedding night itself. And to understand that night, you have to understand one specific object: a piece of cloth. In Hebrew tradition, the cloth on which the couple consummated their marriage was preserved as legal evidence. If the bride was a virgin, there would be blood, the physical proof of an intact hymen. That cloth, or sometimes the garment beneath the bride, would be kept by the bride's parents. This was not metaphor. This was procedure. The book of Deuteronomy, chapter 22, verses 13 through 21, describes the legal framework in precise, unflinching terms. If a husband later claimed that his new wife had not been a virgin at the time of their marriage, her parents could produce the cloth as evidence in her defense. If the evidence supported her, the husband would be fined, flogged, and forbidden ever to divorce her. If the evidence was absent, if the cloth could not be produced, if the proof did not exist, the consequences for the bride were catastrophic. She could be brought to the door of her father's house and stoned by the men of the city. Read that again slowly, not as an abstraction, as the lived reality of a young woman in a Galilean village, somewhere between 12 and 16 years old, lying in a room she had perhaps never been alone in before, next to a man she barely knew, while the noise of the feast continued outside the walls. The cloth was not a private keepsake. It was a legal document, and everyone in that world knew it. This is the architecture of honor and shame that surrounded every aspect of life in first-century Judea. Anthropologists who study this world use the phrase honor-shame culture to describe a social system in which a family's standing, their ability to participate in village life, to make alliances, to access resources, to survive, depended entirely on how they were perceived by the community. Honor was not an internal feeling. It was an external reality assigned by others and taken away by others. And the most volatile intersection of honor and shame in that world was the body of a young woman. Her virginity was not her own private matter. It belonged, in a very real sense, to her father before her marriage and to her husband afterward. It was the seal on a covenant, the proof of a transaction, the guarantee of a lineage, and on the wedding night, that seal would either hold or it would not. What happened when it did not hold, or when there was ambiguity, when the evidence was unclear, when a young body did not respond as expected, was one of the most terrifying possibilities that world offered. Because the biological reality is that the presence or absence of blood is not a reliable indicator of virginity. Ancient people did not know this with certainty. But the law did not accommodate uncertainty. The law demanded evidence, and in the absence of evidence, it demanded blood. Into this world, this precise world of cloth and blood and community witness and devastating consequence, Jesus was born. Mary, his mother, was a betrothed virgin who became pregnant before her wedding night. The cloth that would have certified her virginity would have told a story that was biologically true, but cosmically incomplete. Joseph knew that. The village would have suspected it, and the law knew exactly what to do with a woman in her position. Joseph found out in the quiet, not in the middle of the feast, not surrounded by neighbors and relatives who might immediately transform private grief into public catastrophe. The text of Matthew's Gospel is precise about this in a way that is easy to read past. Joseph discovered that Mary was pregnant. The Greek word used suggests a gradual coming to awareness, not a sudden accusation. He learned it the way a person learns something they had been hoping was not true. Slowly, in the accumulating weight of evidence that could no longer be denied. And his first decision was silence. Matthew says he was a just man, and yet he resolved to divorce her quietly. For a modern reader, those two things can seem contradictory. If he was just, why not demand accountability? Why not invoke the law? Why not bring the matter before the elders at the city gate? Produce the witnesses, follow the procedure that Deuteronomy prescribed, because following that procedure would have killed her. This is the detail that changes everything, and it is only visible when you understand the world Joseph actually lived in. He was not choosing between justice and mercy as abstract moral principles. He was choosing between a legal process that would end in a young woman's death by stoning in front of her father's house, and a quieter, more private dissolution of the betrothal contract that would leave her disgraced but alive. He chose to let her live. In a world where honor was everything, where his own reputation would suffer enormously from the appearance of having been deceived by his betrothed, where the men of the village would whisper and the women would calculate, Joseph chose her survival over his honor. Before the angel spoke to him in the dream, before he had any supernatural reassurance, in the raw human moment of betrayal and grief and confusion, his instinct was toward mercy. Jesus grew up knowing this story. He grew up in the house of a man who had chosen mercy when the law offered him punishment. And when Jesus stood before crowds and spoke about a father who ran toward a returning prodigal son, about a shepherd who left 99 sheep to find one lost one, about a God whose response to human failure was not calculation but embrace. He was not inventing those images from nothing. He had seen that instinct made flesh in the man who raised him. But return now to the wedding night itself, to the young couples who were not Mary and Joseph, to the hundreds of ordinary Galilean households where the feast had ended and the door had closed and the cloth was waiting. The room prepared for the consummation was typically a small chamber, within or adjacent to the groom's family compound. It was not decorated in the way a modern imagination would picture. There were no flowers strewn across a bed, no candles arranged for atmosphere. There was a mat or a low wooden frame strung with rope and covered with a woven blanket. There was a clay oil lamp, small and functional, producing a circle of weak amber light that barely reached the corners of the room. The walls were stone or mud brick, unadorned. The floor was packed earth or rough-cut limestone. Outside, the feast continued. Music, the thin, reedy sound of a Halil flute, the rhythmic percussion of a hand drum, the complex weave of women's voices in a wedding song, drifted through the walls. The smell of roasting meat and spilled wine, and the particular sweetness of date cakes mixed with the night air, which in Galilee carried the scent of wild thyme and dry grass, even in the middle of a village. The young woman sat in that room and waited. She was perhaps 14, perhaps 15, She had been prepared, in the way her culture prepared young women, with instruction from her mother and the older women of her family. She knew, in the practical terms that village life provided, what was expected of her. She knew about the cloth. She knew what it meant. She knew that the evidence of her body would be examined and interpreted and potentially presented before the community. She also knew that her own experience of that night, what she felt, what she needed, whether she was frightened or in pain, was not the primary concern of the ritual she was about to undergo. The groom was young, too, often not much older, 17, 18, perhaps 20. He had also been prepared, though differently, and his preparation had focused on his role as provider, as protector, as the head of a new household. His emotional state on that night, his own fear or uncertainty, was equally invisible in the historical record. Both of them were performing roles that had been scripted long before they were born. What the cloth demanded was blood. And blood, as it happened, was not guaranteed. Ancient medical understanding had no conception of the variation in human anatomy that modern medicine documents with clinical precision. The hymen, the thin membrane whose rupture was expected to produce the blood that certified virginity, varies enormously from person to person. In some women, it is nearly absent from birth. In others, it may have been affected by physical labor, by the kind of strenuous daily work that village girls performed from childhood, carrying heavy water jars on their heads, grinding grain for hours, climbing rocky terrain. None of that labor was considered in the legal calculus of Deuteronomy 22. The law did not say, "Produce blood," unless your daughter spent her childhood carrying water. The law said, "Produce the evidence." And if the evidence was absent, the presumption was guilt. This is the razor's edge on which an ordinary young woman's life balanced on her wedding night in first-century Judea. Not a metaphorical edge, a literal one. The difference between a wedding night that ended in celebration and one that ended in accusation was sometimes nothing more than the particular configuration of her own body, something over which she had no control and no knowledge and no defense. Her parents knew this, which is why the cloth was kept with such care, which is why, in households with the resources to do so, the evidence would sometimes be supplemented, protected, preserved by every means available, which is why the wedding night was attended by anxiety that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with survival. And yet, and this is the detail that keeps returning, the one that refuses to be reduced to sociology or legal history, in the middle of this world of scrutiny and consequence and fear, people fell in love. Not always, not according to a script, but it happened. The Song of Solomon, that strange, passionate, frankly erotic text preserved in the Hebrew canon, did not emerge from a culture that was incapable of desire or tenderness. It emerged from the same world that produced Deuteronomy 22. Both texts are true. Both coexisted. The same young woman who feared the cloth also sometimes reached for her husband's hand in the dark. That tension between institutional demand and human longing, between the world's requirements and the heart's reality, is the tension Jesus addressed again and again throughout his ministry. Not abstractly, with the precision of someone who had grown up watching it play out in the households around him, in the marriages of his neighbors, in the stories his mother may have told him about the night she discovered she was carrying a child who would change the architecture of the world. There is a moment in the Gospel of John that most readers pass through too quickly. A woman is brought before Jesus in the temple courts. The men who bring her are specific about the charge. She was caught in adultery in the very act. They cite Moses. They cite the law. They are not wrong about what the law says. Leviticus and Deuteronomy both prescribe death for this offense. They place her in the center of the crowd, and they wait, stones already conceptually in hand, for Jesus to either endorse the law or contradict it, either of which would serve their purpose. Jesus bends down and writes in the dust. Scholars have debated for centuries what he wrote. The text does not tell us. But consider for a moment not what he wrote, but what he did not do. He did not look at her, not immediately. In a world where a woman in this position was already being consumed by the eyes of every man present, where her body and her shame and her failure were the entire spectacle, Jesus directed his gaze downward. He removed himself, temporarily, from the machinery of her humiliation. Then he stood and said the words that have echoed across 2,000 years. "Let the one among you who is without sin cast the first stone." And then he bent down again and wrote in the dust again. One by one, beginning with the oldest, they left. When Jesus finally looked at her, when he was the only one remaining, when the crowd had dissolved and taken its verdict with it, he asked her where her accusers had gone. She said no one had condemned her. And he said, "Neither do I. Go, and sin no more." To read that scene without the context of first-century Judea is to read it as a beautiful abstraction. To read it with that context is to understand that Jesus was standing in direct confrontation with an entire social architecture, the architecture of cloth and blood and community witness and honor and shame that had governed the lives of women in that world for 1,000 years before he was born. He was not simply being kind to one woman on one morning. He was declaring, in the most public possible forum, that the machinery of shame did not have the final word on human worth. He had grown up watching that machinery operate. He had seen it in the faces of the women in Nazareth who knew Mary's story, or thought they did. He had seen it in the careful way his mother moved through the village, carrying a history that the village had assigned to her without her consent. He had seen it in the young brides who entered their wedding nights carrying the full weight of a community's judgment on the most vulnerable moment of their lives. And he had seen something else, too, something the machinery could not account for and could not contain. He had seen Joseph choose mercy. He had seen his mother carry grace in a body the law had already condemned. He had grown up in a household that existed because one man, on one quiet night, had decided that a woman's life was worth more than his honor. That is the household that produced the Sermon on the Mount. That is the household that produced the parable of the prodigal son. That is the household that produced a man who would look at a woman caught in adultery and bend down to write in the dust rather than pick up a stone. Now return one final time to the wedding night, not to a specific night, not to Mary or to the woman in the temple, but to the ordinary recurring reality of it, playing out in village after village, across Galilee and Judea, and the whole of the ancient Jewish world. The feast has ended. The music has stilled. The last of the guests have found their way home through the narrow, dark streets, their voices fading into the night. The groom's family waits in the courtyard, not sleeping, not quite celebrating yet, waiting for the word, for the signal, for the evidence that will allow the celebration to resume. Inside the small stone room, two young people are alone together, for perhaps the first time in their lives. Whatever happened in that room, whatever tenderness or awkwardness or fear or pain or unexpected gentleness passed between them, the world outside the door was waiting for proof. Not for their experience of each other, not for what they felt or said or discovered, for blood on cloth, for the certification of a transaction that had been agreed upon years before either of them had any say in it. And sometimes the proof came, and the celebration resumed, and the families embraced in the courtyard, and the wine flowed again, and the young couple began their life together under the full canopy of community approval. And sometimes the proof was ambiguous or absent, and the machinery of shame began to turn, and a young woman who had done nothing wrong stood at the edge of a catastrophe she could not explain and could not escape. Both outcomes were possible on any given wedding night in that world. The difference between them was sometimes character, sometimes circumstance, sometimes nothing more than the body's own unpredictable response to a night no one had prepared her to navigate with anything other than fear and duty. Jesus knew this world with the intimacy of someone who had been born into its most extreme version of this vulnerability. His mother had stood at exactly that edge, the edge between mercy and catastrophe, between a man who chose the law and a man who chose her life. The angel had come to Joseph in a dream, yes, but before the dream, there was a man making a human decision in the dark, choosing the harder and more costly kind of justice, the kind that preserves rather than destroys. The Christian faith does not begin in a cathedral. It does not begin in a theological argument or a creedal formula or a moment of private spiritual experience. It begins in a small village in Galilee, in the domestic architecture of honor and shame and betrothal and wedding nights and cloth kept as evidence. It begins in the body of a young woman and the conscience of a carpenter and the radical, disruptive, world-altering decision that mercy is not a weakness, but the most demanding form of faithfulness available to a human being. When Jesus said, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy," he was not offering a spiritual principle for contemplation. He was describing something he had watched with his own eyes, in his own house, from the very beginning of his life. The wedding night in Jesus' world was not romantic. It was not private. It was not gentle by design. But in the middle of that world, in the middle of its harshness and its surveillance and its devastating consequences for the bodies of young women, something else was also possible, something that could not be legislated or certified or produced as evidence on a piece of cloth. The possibility of a man who looked at a woman and chose, without proof, to believe in her. That choice, repeated, elaborated, universalized, became the gospel.